My name is Clara, and I need to tell you what happened the night my husband looked me in the eyes and chose his mother over everything we had built together, not out of weakness, as I once believed, out of cold, deliberate calculation that had been months in the making. I came home that Tuesday evening with flour dusted on the sleeve of my jacket, a blister forming on my right heel, and 12 hours of an 11-hour shift carved into every bone of my body. The restaurant I co-owned with my best friend, Diane, had been open for exactly 14 months, and we were finally starting to turn a profit. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind that comes with champagne and press releases. A quiet, dignified profit. The kind that feels like a deep breath after a long time underwater. I had been working myself ragged for over a year, sourcing suppliers, training staff, managing the books at midnight, tasting sauces at 7 in the morning. It was my dream, wrapped in grease and exhaustion, and I loved it with everything I had. Our house, my house, technically, inherited from my grandmother, who had passed 2 years before I met Daniel, was a pale yellow Victorian with a wraparound porch and a kitchen that smelled of old wood and something faintly floral that never quite went away, no matter how many times we repainted. My grandmother had left it to me alone, in a will that was clear and unambiguous, and I had poured every memory of her into its walls. It sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in the kind of neighborhood where people still waved from their driveways, where the mail carrier knew everyone by name. I had grown up visiting that house every summer. It was the most permanent thing in my life. Daniel and I had been married for 3 years. He was charming in the way that some men are, reflexively, effortlessly, like breathing. And I had found it irresistible when we met at a colleague's dinner party, where he had made the entire table laugh with a story about getting lost in Montmartre. He was half French, which explained the ease with which he wore carelessness, like a well-cut jacket. His mother, Vivienne, lived in Paris, and for the first 2 years of our marriage, that distance had been a luxury I hadn't fully appreciated. She visited once a year, stayed for 10 days, and the visits were manageable, if slightly exhausting. She was precise, impeccably dressed, and had a way of surveying a room that made you feel the room had failed some private inspection. She never said anything outright unkind. She simply implied, with a raised eyebrow or a fractional pause before a compliment, that things could be improved, that I could be improved. But she was far away, and I had convinced myself that this was simply the texture of having a French mother-in-law, cultural, minor, manageable. Daniel worked in finance. He earned well, but less than I had begun to earn as the restaurant grew, and I know now, that this mattered to him more than he ever admitted. When the restaurant started to succeed, his congratulations were warm but brief, like a light switching on and off. He would ask about the numbers sometimes in a tone that was almost clinical, as if he were reviewing a report rather than celebrating a dream. I noticed, but I told myself it was just how he processed things. I am very good, I have since learned, at convincing myself that small wrongnesses are simply different languages. That November Tuesday, I had driven home through a cold, gray drizzle, the kind of rain that doesn't commit to falling, but just hovers at cheek level, damp and miserable. I was thinking about the new dessert menu, about whether the fig tart was too sweet, about whether I needed to hire another sous chef for the weekend rush. I was not thinking about Vivienne. She had not visited since the previous spring, and Daniel had mentioned, casually, over breakfast a week ago, that she might come sometime this winter. I had thought, fine, 10 days, I can do 10 days. I had not thought, she is already here. The lights in the house were blazing when I pulled into the driveway. Through the front window, I could see the flicker of candles, my grandmother's silver candlesticks, the ones I kept on the sideboard and used only for occasions, and the warm amber glow of the dining room, fully set with the good china. I sat in the car for a moment puzzled. We did not do candlelit dinners on Tuesday nights. We did takeout on the sofa on Tuesday nights, usually with something on television, and the simple comfort of that routine was something I had come to treasure. I got out of the car. I was still in my work clothes. Dark trousers, a loose white shirt with a pale orange stain on the cuff from a sauce incident at lunch, and my jacket with the flower on the sleeve. I had not had time to change at the restaurant, and it hadn't occurred to me that I would need to. I walked up the porch steps, noting that Vivienne's familiar burgundy suitcase was propped beside the door like a small, imperious sentinel. I pushed open the front door and was hit immediately by the smell of something expensive cooking. Not my cooking, not anything I had prepared, and beneath it, thick and authoritative as a proclamation, the unmistakable signature of Vivienne's perfume. Daniel appeared from the hallway in a shirt I hadn't seen him wear in months, freshly pressed, his hair combed back. He looked, in that first moment, almost like a stranger, or like a version of himself assembled for an audience. And then he saw me and something crossed his face. Not joy, not even warmth. Something closer to alarm, quickly suppressed and rearranged. He walked toward me with the purposeful lightness of a man trying to intercept a problem, and I opened my mouth to say something. Hello, probably, or is your mother here? And he raised one hand, palm outward, and said it. You smell like work. Go away. Mom's here from Paris. Don't ruin dinner. I stood there in the open doorway of my own home, the house my grandmother had left to me, the house where I had carried my childhood summers like pressed flowers between the pages of every room, and I heard those words arrange themselves into a sentence, and then that sentence arrange itself into a meaning, and the meaning was this: I was unwelcome in my own home on a Tuesday night. Because I smelled like work, because his mother was here from Paris. I did not cry. What I felt was not grief, not yet. What I felt was a particular kind of cold, not the cold of the November rain outside, but something interior, a dropping of temperature in some central place in me, as if a window had been opened in a room that had always been warm. I stood in the doorway and looked at my husband's face, and for the first time I did not see Daniel who was charming or Daniel who was mine. I saw something else. I saw a man who had lit the good candles and worn the good shirt and placed his wife, outside the threshold of her own home as casually as he might move a coat from a chair. I said very quietly, "Excuse me?" He lowered his voice and leaned toward me with the urgent, pressured politeness of someone managing an embarrassment at a dinner party. "Clara, please. She only just arrived this afternoon. She's exhausted from the flight. She's been cooking all day. She went to 3 shops for the ingredients. It would mean a lot if you just go upstairs, change, freshen up, and come down in 20 minutes. Can you do that? Please." From the dining room, I heard the soft percussion of silverware being repositioned, and then Vivienne's voice, light and floating as cigarette smoke. "Daniel, la soupe refroidie." "The soup is getting cold." Daniel looked at me with an expression that contained equal measures of apology and command. 20 minutes, he said, and turned and walked back toward the dining room without waiting for my answer. I stood in the doorway of my own home for exactly 3 seconds. Then I stepped inside, closed the door quietly behind me, and walked upstairs. I did change. I want to be honest about that. I did exactly what he asked, because I was, at that point in my life, still a person who believed that accommodation was the same as strength, that absorbing friction was a form of grace. I changed into clean clothes, washed my face in the cold water of my grandmother's old bathroom with its blue tiles and its single window that looked out onto the garden, and went back downstairs in 18 minutes. I told myself, it's one dinner. I told myself, she's his mother. I told myself, this is manageable. Vivienne was already seated at the head of the table. The head, in the chair that faced the room, the one that had always been my grandmother's. and she looked up when I entered with the precise smile she had always deployed, warm at the surface, assessing in the center, like a thermometer disguised as a welcome. She was wearing a silk blouse in deep green, her dark hair pinned with effortless authority, her reading glasses pushed up on her head with a Parisian nonchalance that I had always secretly found intimidating. "Clara, chérie," she said, "you look better. Come, sit." I sat. I ate her soup, which was extraordinarily good, a velvety chestnut velouté with a curl of crème fraîche that dissolved on the tongue, and I answered her questions about the restaurant with appropriate enthusiasm, and I watched her watch me across the rim of her wine glass with eyes that were calculating in a way I had been steadily, carefully, deliberately not acknowledging for 3 years. Daniel, beside her, ate with focused pleasure and made the conversation bright, translating easily between French and English when Vivienne reached for a word, deflecting and smoothing like a skilled moderator. Somewhere between the soup and the roasted lamb, I decided I was imagining things, that I was tired, that Daniel's words at the door had been thoughtless and hurtful, and that I would tell him so later, privately, and that we would sort it out the way people in marriages do, with difficulty and honesty and the eventual relief of understanding. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. Vivienne was staying. It emerged over the lamb, not for 10 days, for a month. She had sublet her Paris apartment to a young couple who needed somewhere through the holidays. She would stay with us through Christmas and into the new year if necessary. She delivered this information with the serene confidence of someone announcing a pleasant surprise rather than an occupation. Her hands folded on the table, her expression benign, her eyes briefly, just briefly, on Daniel as she finished the sentence. Daniel nodded beside her, and the nod was the wrong size. Too small, too quickly completed. The nod of a man who already knew. I said, "Of course. How lovely." And I smiled. And somewhere deep in the architecture of the house, or of me, something settled into a new and unfamiliar position, and I felt it, the way you feel a tremor before you understand what it is. The weeks that followed were a kind of theater. Vivienne cooked elaborately every other evening and received Daniel's compliments with the composed pleasure of an artist acknowledging tribute. She rearranged the kitchen twice, first the spices, then the pots, with the explanation that it was more logical this way. She walked through the house with her hands clasped at her back and her gaze roaming the walls, the window sills, the original crown molding, in a way that was not admiring so much as appraising. She asked, one afternoon when Daniel was at work and we were drinking coffee at the kitchen table, whether the upkeep on such an old property was difficult. I told her the house was in good condition, well maintained. She nodded. She said, "Of course. But these old houses, so much equity. It would be a shame to let it sit." I put down my coffee cup. I said, "It's my home, Vivienne. It's not sitting." She smiled and changed the subject to the weather in Paris. I told Diane about it on the phone that evening, standing in the back garden with my coat on and my voice low, the cold air pressing against my face while the kitchen windows glowed gold behind me. And somewhere inside the house, Vivienne ran a bath that used all the hot water. Diane listened without interrupting, which she almost never did, and then she said, "Clara, watch your back." I laughed. I told her she was being dramatic. She said evenly, "I know what difficult mother-in-law looks like, and I know what a plan looks like. This is the second one." I told her I would be careful. I hung up and went back inside and helped Vivienne dry the dishes, and she hummed something French and faintly satisfied, and I told myself, 10 more days, maybe 12. The first real fracture appeared 10 days into her stay. I came home late on a Thursday, past 9, inventory night, and found Daniel and Vivienne at the kitchen table with a spread of papers between them, speaking in rapid, low French that stopped the instant I pushed through the door. They stop the way people stop, not because a conversation has reached its natural end, but because a door has opened. Daniel stood. He gathered the papers into a folder with one clean, practiced motion, the motion of someone who has rehearsed this exact gesture, and tucked the folder under his arm. He said easily, warmly, "We were just going over some investment stuff. How is inventory?" He crossed the kitchen and kissed me on the cheek. The kiss was the right temperature, the right pressure, the greeting of a husband coming home to his wife, and yet... "What kind of investments?" I asked. My voice was light. My hands at my sides were still. Vivienne smiled from the table, her coffee cup raised. "Just some thoughts about the future," she said. "Daniel worries, you know. He likes to plan ahead. It is very responsible of him." "Plans for what, specifically?" I asked. "Oh, various things." She waved her hand. That particular wave she had, elegant and dismissive as a duchess declining a canapé. Property values, equity. These old houses have so much potential. It would be a shame not to think about it carefully. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at the countertop, tracing the edge of it with one finger in a slow, absent-minded loop that I recognized after 3 years of marriage as the gesture he made when he was not absent-minded at all. "I see," I said. 2 words. Small, quiet words, like stones dropped into deep water. He looked up. His smile was the smile of a man reassuring himself. "It's nothing dramatic, just ideas. I'll explain later. I'm exhausted." "Come to bed?" I went upstairs. I changed. I lay in the dark for 2 hours beside a man whose breathing slowed to sleep in under 4 minutes, and I stared at the ceiling and thought about the folder. I thought about the practiced motion of his hands. I thought about Vivienne's eyes on the crown molding, on the baseboards, on the windows, calculating potential rather than appreciating beauty. I thought about the word equity. I thought about my grandmother pressing my hand and saying, "This is yours, Clara. Always yours." I did not sleep until nearly 3 in the morning, and when I finally did, I dreamed of the house on fire, and Daniel and Vivienne standing in the front garden, in their good clothes, watching it burn. The discovery happened on a Saturday morning, 12 days after Vivienne's arrival, while she and Daniel were at the farmer's market 3 blocks away, and I was alone in the house for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. I had planned to do nothing more threatening than make a second cup of coffee and sit in the garden with a book. But when I walked through the dining room, I noticed that Daniel had left his laptop open on the table. A small thing, a careless thing, the kind of thing husbands do. The screen was still lit. I glanced at it as I passed, the way you glance at anything bright, reflexively, without intention, and then I stopped. What I saw on the screen was a PDF, a document with a header I recognized immediately, the name of the law firm that had handled my grandmother's estate. I recognized it because I had sat in that office and signed papers in that office and cried quietly in the bathroom of that office after my grandmother's will was read. I would have recognized those letterheads in my sleep. But this was not the document I had signed. This was something else. I set my coffee cup on the table. I sat down in the chair in front of the laptop. My hands were steady. I remember being surprised by that my hands were completely steady while the rest of me went very, very still, the way prey animals go still. I leaned forward and I read. It was a draft agreement, a document proposing the transfer of my property, my grandmother's house, my house, the pale yellow Victorian with the wraparound porch and the blue-tiled bathroom and the kitchen that smelled of old wood, into a joint family trust. The trust had 3 named beneficiaries, Daniel, Vivienne, and a name I did not immediately recognize, which I later understood to be Vivienne's sister, a woman I had met once at our wedding and not thought about since. My name was not on the document, not once. Not as owner, not as party, not as the woman who had inherited this property and lived in it and loved it and repainted its walls and planted things in its garden. I was not on the document at all. The date on the draft was 3 weeks ago, 1 week before Vivienne had arrived. I sat at the table for a long time. The house was very quiet around me. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked, and the refrigerator hummed, and outside the window a bird was making a sound in the garden, a single insistent note, repeated and repeated, as if trying to tell me something I needed to hear. I scrolled down through the document. There were multiple pages. There were annotations in the margins, in French, in Daniel's handwriting, the neat, precise cursive he used when he was being careful. Careful. I thought, he has been careful. He has been very, very careful. I stood up from the table. I walked to the kitchen. I ran cold water over my wrists, the way my grandmother had taught me when I was a child and overwhelmed. She used to say the cold water brings you back to your body. It brought me back. My heart was very loud. My vision had a strange, bright edge to it, as if the room had been overexposed. My legs were solid, but my stomach was not, and for a moment I thought I was going to be sick, and I pressed both hands flat on the kitchen counter and breathed through it, slow and even, until the nausea passed. Then I went back to the laptop. I photographed every page with my phone, the images clear and steady, because my hands had found their stillness again. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of something that has made a decision. I checked the email tab. The document had been sent from Daniel's email to an address I didn't recognize 3 weeks ago, with the subject line, "Draft for review. Property matter." The reply came 2 days later. Reviewed. Some adjustments needed. We'll discuss in person when V arrives. Signed with a single initial, M. I photographed the email thread. I closed the laptop exactly as I had found it. I picked up my coffee cup, carried it to the kitchen, and stood at the window and watched the empty garden. The fig tree my grandmother had planted along the fence was bare in November, its branches gray and patient, waiting for spring. I called Diane. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what I had found, quietly, in full, without stopping. When I finished, there was a silence. Then she said, "I'm coming over." I said, "Not yet, not until I know more." Another silence. "Clara," she said, "don't confront him tonight. Don't do anything tonight. Promise me." I promised her. I hung up. I stood in the kitchen of my grandmother's house and I thought, I need a lawyer. I had one. A property attorney named Marcus Webb, who had handled the estate filing 2 years before and who had given me his card at the end of our meeting with the words, "Call me if anything comes up with the property. These situations can get complicated." I had thought at the time that he was simply being professionally thorough. I understood now that he had seen something in the paperwork or in my situation that I had not. I called him on Monday morning from my car, parked 2 streets away from the restaurant. He remembered me immediately. I described the document. He asked 3 precise questions. Was my name on the house deed as sole owner? Yes. Had I signed any power of attorney agreements since inheriting? No. Had my husband ever asked me to sign documents related to the house that I had not fully reviewed? I thought. There had been something? 6 months ago. A form, he had said it was for insurance purposes. I had signed it quickly at the kitchen table. I told Marcus this. A pause. He said, "Can you send me what you photographed?" I sent it from the parking lot, still in my car, the heater running, my breath faintly visible in the cold air. He called back in 40 minutes. He said, "The draft is not executed, which means they haven't acted yet, but the intent is clear, and there may be more. Can you look for any other documents in your home that you haven't signed yourself?" There were more. I found them that same evening, while Daniel was at the gym and Vivienne was in her room making a phone call in French. The folder, the one Daniel had swept off the kitchen table that Thursday night, was in the back of his desk drawer beneath a sheaf of bank statements that were themselves a revelation. A savings account I didn't know existed, opened 8 months ago with regular deposits that roughly corresponded to the gap between his stated monthly transfer to our joint account and his actual salary. He had been skimming. Not hugely, not in a way that was obviously dramatic, but steadily, carefully for 8 months, he'd been moving money into a separate account in his name only. I stood in the study with the folder in my hands and the bank statement spread on the desk, and the world did that thing it does in moments of true shock. It slowed and sharpened and became very, very detailed. I could see the grain of the desk surface beneath the papers. I could hear the faint vibration of Vivienne's voice through the ceiling, still on her phone, still speaking French, still making plans in a language she had always known I couldn't fully follow. I thought, of course that was the point. I photographed everything. I put everything back exactly as I had found it. I went to the kitchen and cooked dinner, a simple pasta, something to occupy my hands. And when Daniel came home, flushed from the gym, and kissed me on the top of my head, I said, "Dinner in 15 minutes." And he said, "Perfect," and sat at the table with his phone. And I stood at the stove and stirred the pasta and thought, "You are not as careful as you believe." The confrontation came 4 days later. I chose the timing with the deliberateness of someone who has stopped acting on emotion and started acting on strategy. A transition that had happened somewhere in the space between the kitchen counter and the lawyer's office. Quietly, without announcement, like a door closing. I had met with Marcus twice. I had given him everything. He had confirmed the picture. The unsigned draft was the centerpiece of a plan to use a newly prepared power of attorney. Not the insurance form, which was exactly what it claimed, but a new one they had intended to present to me during Vivienne's visit, likely framed as estate planning, likely over wine, with Daniel explaining it warmly and Vivienne's eyes on me to gauge whether I would sign. They had not yet executed any step that was legally actionable, but the intent, the preparation, the hidden account, all of it was documented. All of it was mine. I chose a Sunday evening, after dinner, when Vivienne was in the sitting room with her book and Daniel was washing up in the kitchen. I came into the kitchen, closed the door, and put a folder on the counter beside the dish rack. Daniel looked at it, and something moved behind his eyes. A recognition, small and fast, the recognition of a man who sees the thing he has been dreading. "Sit down," I said. My voice was completely level. "Clara." "Sit down, Daniel." He sat. I opened the folder. I placed the photographs of the draft document in front of him, one at a time, giving him time to look at each one. He looked at them. He did not look at me. His jaw was working, very slightly, as if he were composing and discarding sentences, trying each one against the weight of what was in front of him and finding them all inadequate. "I want you to explain this to me," I said, carefully, all of it. The silence stretched between us like a wire pulled too tight. Then he said, "It wasn't supposed to go this far." "What wasn't?" He passed his hand over his face. "Maman, she has ideas. She's always had ideas about the house, about how it should be used, how it should be." I told her it wasn't realistic, but she kept pushing, and she started involving this lawyer she knows, and He stopped. "And you helped her," I said. "I thought if I was involved, I could control it." I looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then I put the bank statements in front of him. "The savings account, Daniel. The 8 months of deposits. Explain that." He went very still. The color left his face in a way I had never seen before. A slow, complete draining, as if something had been unplugged. He said very quietly, "How did you—" "That doesn't matter. Explain it." The silence was deafening. He stared at the table. He stared at his hands. Then he said, "Maman wanted to be sure there was capital available. If the property were transferred and then sold, she wanted the proceeds to have somewhere to go immediately. I was supposed to— The account was a placeholder. I wasn't going to keep it, Clara." "You opened a secret bank account," I said, "and fed it for 8 months. as a placeholder. The word sat in the air between us, absurd, insufficient, almost insulting in its smallness against the thing it was being asked to explain. He said nothing. "That is theft, Daniel. From our household? From me?" The words were quiet, not hot, cold, the way steel is cold when you pick it up in winter. "That is what that is." He looked up. His eyes were red at the edges, and his expression was the expression of a man who has been found out and is now rapidly calculating the cost of remorse versus the cost of continued denial. He said, I know how it looks. I'm sorry." The apology came easily, too easily. The apology of a man who uses, "I'm sorry," the way some people use hand gestures, reflexively to fill space, without weight behind it. I closed the folder. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen door. "Clara, I'm going to speak to your mother." "No, please, let me handle it. I opened the kitchen door and walked into the sitting room. Vivienne was in the armchair by the window with her book, and she looked up when I came in, and her expression shifted through several registers in the space of a second. Surprise, assessment, recognition, composure. Like a series of masks tried on and discarded before settling on the correct one. She took off her reading glasses. She set them on the side table with a small, deliberate click. "Clara," she said with the warmth of a woman who has done nothing. I sat across from her. Daniel had followed me into the room and was standing in the doorway, his hand on the frame, as if he needed something solid to hold. "I know about the draft transfer document," I said. "I know about the lawyer. I know about the trust. And I know about the account Daniel opened on your instruction." I paused and let that settle. "I want to hear you explain it. In English, please." She was quiet for a moment. She set her book on the side table with the care of someone setting down something fragile. When she looked at me again, the warmth was gone, and what was beneath it was not cold, exactly, but clear, precise. The face of a woman who has stopped performing. "This house," she said, "is sitting in the hands of someone who does not understand what it is worth. You run a restaurant. You do not have the resources or the expertise to manage what this property could become. Daniel is my son. He should have a proper share." "Stop!" The word came out like a closed door. "This house was left to me by my grandmother. My name is on the deed, my name alone. Daniel has no claim to it, no legal standing regarding it, and neither do you. What you have been planning for months, while eating at my table and sleeping in my house and rearranging my kitchen and speaking French over papers you hid when I walked in, is fraud." Vivienne's chin came up. "You are being very dramatic." "I am being very accurate," I said. "And I want you to know that I have a property attorney. I have photographs of the draft document and the email correspondence. I have the bank records. Tomorrow morning, my attorney will send a formal letter to the law firm whose name appears on that draft, informing them that any attempt to proceed will be met with legal action, including charges of fraud, conspiracy, and breach of fiduciary duty." I held her gaze. "I suggest you speak to your lawyer friend tonight." The room was absolutely quiet. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. Vivienne looked at me and I looked back, and the silence between us was not uncomfortable for me. Not anymore. I had lived for weeks inside her silence, inside her assessing eyes and her elegant dismissals, and I had mistaken my discomfort for her power. I understood now that the two things are not the same. "And you," I said, turning to Daniel, "you have 48 hours to decide what you want, whether you stay and rebuild something honest or whether you go. But understand this. This house is not part of any negotiation. It was never and will never be part of any deal. It was my grandmother's. It is mine. And no one in this family is taking it from me." Daniel said, "Clara, I love you. I made a terrible mistake. I want to fix this." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought of the flower on my jacket and the palm raised in my face at my own front door. I thought of the practiced motion of his hands sweeping the folder away. I thought of 8 months of careful, steady theft. I thought of the dream of the fire and the 2 figures watching it in their good clothes. "I know you do," I said, and I walked out of the room. Diane arrived 20 minutes later with wine and her husband Owen, who is a civil attorney and who sat at my kitchen table until midnight going over everything I had documented and photographed. At the end of it, he looked across the table at me and said, "You're in a very strong position. I'm sorry this happened to you." I said, "Don't be. I needed to know." Vivienne left 2 days later. She stood at the front door with her burgundy suitcase and said, in the voice of a woman conceding a chess match, "You are stronger than I thought." I said, "Yes." She nodded once and walked to the taxi, and I watched it from the porch until it rounded the corner and was gone. The law firm sent a letter within a week acknowledging receipt of Marcus's correspondence and confirming they would take no further action on the matter. The lawyer, the M from the email thread, lost his license several months later for an unrelated scheme, which surprised no one who knew how these things tend to travel. The hidden account was closed and the funds returned in full, documented, as part of a formal separation agreement. Daniel and I divorced quietly, without drama, and the house remained mine, which had always been the only possible outcome for anyone willing to look at the paperwork. I still run the restaurant with Diane. Last spring, we opened a second location. I still live in the pale yellow Victorian with the wraparound porch. In March, I sat on that porch on the first warm evening of the year with a cup of tea and the sound of the neighborhood settling into dusk. Someone mowing 2 houses down, a dog barking in a leisurely way, the mail carrier calling out a greeting to the people across the street. I thought about my grandmother and the way she had pressed my hand and the words she had said that I had believed and then forgotten and then had to earn back the hard way. "This is yours, Clara. Always yours." The fig tree along the back fence was putting out its first new leaves, small and bright and impossibly green in the late light. The house smelled of old wood and something faintly floral, and underneath it, whatever I had been cooking earlier, something warm, something mine, something no one had made for an audience. I had lost a marriage, and the comfortable shape of the life I had believed I was building, and the quiet certainty that the person beside me was the person I had chosen. These are real losses. I do not minimize them. But I had kept everything that was given to me in love and released everything that was offered in performance. And it turned out those were 2 very different inventories. And knowing the difference, finally and completely, was worth every difficult thing it had cost me to learn it. Some things are yours. The only thing that was ever threatening them was your own willingness to look away.